All right, thanks much for the invite. Can everybody hear me all right? So, hey, if there's questions on the way, no problem stopping and answering and going through. A conversation's great. I appreciate the invite. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys. So, I'm a farm kid from Iowa. So I grew up on a farm in north central Iowa. Came through Iowa State as an engineer in my graduate studies. That's sort of how an engineer ends up working on a whole bunch of agronomic kinds of problems, I suppose, once you evolve into your further career. So first couple of things. We're going to give you just a little hint about who we are as a company, and then I'm going to give some history, how we built these things, what happened within the DOE research program that made these things evolve. You'll get a hint of a couple of the products that we're putting out, but we were going to spend a lot more time on the technical elements and try and give you guys, this crowd, I believe the interest will be on what we're doing technically and how it works. And so if you have questions about how we're turning this into a business and what our products look like and those sorts of things, feel free to grab me later and we can get into that deeper. And I have several cards up here also. So if we think about precision agriculture, right, we're about 2 decades into this. Roughly, okay? We've known what the target is. Really, you hear right seed, right place, right product, right place. That's essentially the notion that we want to see, okay? We've known that the whole time. What we've seen happen is a lot of work towards improving data and building better control systems. These efforts have been very effective. We have better data. We have better control systems. The reality is we're just starting to see these scales of decisions start to change. We're just starting to see precision agriculture start to reach some of these milestones back here. And what we think is the challenge here is that better data and better control systems don't automatically equal better decisions. Okay? That's where our company, Praxic, feels like we can add some things into the marketplace using integrated data management and simulation strategies in order to help make the better decisions. So the platform that we use is built with this environmental process engine, which you see this acronym LEAF. It stands for Landscape Environmental Assessment Framework. This is the open source integrated modeling framework that we built over about the last 5 years coming into the company within the DOE program that we were working on. Okay? And really what we're trying to do is make unlike models and unlike data structures work together so that we can answer a broader set of questions. Okay? What we're doing within the company is we're applying this engine towards a series of specific value-added applications. All right, and this is sort of this flow that we have. We're keeping this and most of the elements of this in the open source realm so that we can work with folks like yourselves as we move forward. So the next question is, how do we do this? All right. So you've heard the term sort of integrated data management environmental process simulation. We'll give you a better sense of that as we go through. We're sort of unique in how we manage that. We're using environmental models in a little bit different way than what they've been used before. And this is sort of that focus on the decision element. And we'll learn a little bit more about that too. And one of the key things that really makes this all possible right now at a production scale is cheap, scalable compute. We've got lots of cheap, scalable compute we can throw at these kinds of problems, and that makes this work for us. So a little bit of history. You guys might, I know several have, maybe all have heard of the billion-ton study that came out clear back in 2005 from the Department of Energy. And the genesis for this was to say, is there enough biomass out there that we can build a biofuels industry that can have a significant impact? And so when this report came out, crop residues like corn stover, which we see lots of bales, stacks of bales around here with what's going on with the DuPont plant over in Nevada, accounted for a massive amount of the material of the billion-ton. Of course, they had to come up with a billion-ton because it was entitled the billion-ton study. It would have been a major letdown if they hadn't come up with a billion-ton somewhere, I suppose. But this number got challenged pretty heavily within the soil science and agronomic communities. The notion was that key factors, specifically soil organic matter constraints associated with harvesting crop residues, were not considered effectively enough. So this was the genesis of our work when we were at the INL and within the Department of Energy program. So we built a large network of field trials that included USDA researchers, lots of land-grant university researchers, and some private folks also that went out and started to tackle this along with other energy crop development activities. It's called the Regional Feedstock Partnership Program. And we did have quite a few trials focused on this residue question. And within this effort, we're also working on building residue removal decision tools. So here's sort of a characterization of the residue problem. You start here, there's some place that there's a minimum viable yield. So if you can't have X amount of residue, your system's not going to work. The economics simply won't allow the system to function. This number is somewhere between 1 and 2 ton, depending on who you talk to, which supply chain that's out there. The reality is, as in everything in agriculture, yield wins. Okay, so the economics, the logistics, the contracting, all of those elements would like to see us be able to take more. But the reality is we're dealing with a secondary resource. So the problems, the variabilities that we see in our current production systems around commodities amplify when we start removing residue. And so we've got these environmental limiting factors that can drive this line down. These are things like organic carbon, erosion, nutrient management, the water and temperature dynamics, all the way through to off-site environmental degradation. So when we look at this, this becomes a pretty challenging decision tool problem. All right? And that was sort of the genesis of this effort. So what we sought to do is figure out effectively where this line was actually at. So then we could move down here and start looking at the agronomic strategies that would put a system together that could function. So when we got into this, the reality is a lot of the data, a lot of the models, a lot of the components we needed existed, and they have vast amounts of validation, verification, investment already made in them. And in some cases, they exist in workflows where certifications already happen. So we did not want to change these models. We just wanted to make them work together in a way that they were never built to do. So that's where we started to get into this. And so this was the first sort of iteration of the tool set that we built. And what I'll call this is it's sort of an automated high-performance compute version of an NRCS conservation management planning process. And we do it a little bit more effectively than they can do in the field offices because, well, a couple of reasons. We can run at much finer spatial scales, but we can also include some additional models that they may select from depending on where they're at regionally. So we applied this to first come back and rebuild the billion-ton study. And there's a billion-ton update that came out in 2011. So we recalculated how much residue is actually available. The important thing when we look at these maps, I hope you guys in the back can see it all right, is there is 100 million unique NRCS conservation management plans underpinning these maps. Okay, that's pretty powerful stuff. Interesting takeaways from the data, where we look at where there's quite a bit of residue available here in 2011. This map in 2030 looks pretty much the same, except these numbers got a little bigger. What that tells us is where it's good now, it's proportionally even better in 2030, if you're thinking about how the cellulosic industry emerges around residues. And when we look at the by-crop specific yields, we see that corn is really the only one that gets us to those economically viable harvest rates. And that's why we see these industries emerging around corn also. What we found is that actually right now we're seeing about 165 million tons available. With just yield increases, we can get up to about 230 million tons. When we start to look at things like tillage, reductions in tillage, we can get up to 300 plus. Now, as we go through a few more of the data sets, what we'll show is that that initial number that was fought so hard in the original billion-ton study of about 450 million tons is actually about right. It's just that we have to do a bunch of things agronomically to make it accessible in a sustainable way. Now, this was great, and it was important within the DOE program to get these numbers calibrated in a way that all of the stakeholders could get on board with. The reality is it doesn't help a guy like my dad make decisions about residue removal in his field. And this is sort of how this problem complicates within our current systems. We have diverse soil characteristics. We have diverse topographies. And there's the impact of biomass productivity, which our corollary for this problem is grain yield. So we need to be able to look at that, at these subfield scale variabilities and how they impact it. So what we did is we pointed that conservation planning tool set in a way that now we come in, and for each of these fields, we take a yield harvest monitor, and we do a conservation plan at every yield data point in order to start to understand what happens when we start to implement various practices. So in this case, it's a 140-acre field in north central Iowa. It's got about 24,000 yield data points. So we can run 24,000 conservation plans to investigate the highly local impacts of our residue removal practices. This field has pretty diverse soil characteristics, more so than your average farm in Iowa. It has a sandy ridge here. What we see is that impacts grain yield quite a lot. These areas are less than 50 bushel per acre yields. We see that on areas. It's a little more extensive in this field, but you still have those places north of, say, 220 also. Okay? Now, when we come through and we look at what happens if you implement a commercial residue removal practice, like a rake and bale, something like what Pioneer DuPont has been doing around here, building all of these stacks, this is about what the removal rate would be using grain yield as sort of the corollary to the biomass productivity, the stover productivity. Okay? Now, with that run as 24,000 conservation plans, we can look at the sustainability characteristics across all of those variable sections of the field. What we find in this field is that most of the area under those removal conditions actually have a carbon problem. Some areas we could take it off and be just fine. In other areas we'd have a carbon and an erosion problem. All right? So this becomes pretty informative in starting to understand what we're doing here. This field is sort of the perfect field that DuPont or Poet, the folks that are trying to harvest stover, would target. It's uniform and it's very high yielding. Lots of 200 plus bushel per acre. So we have a lot of biomass there. And when we carry it through, what we find is pretty much all of this field, we can go ahead and implement those commercial practices as they exist now. There's some interesting things. When we look at this, we start to see these speckles where the system's telling us we have a carbon problem. We know soil organic matter characteristics are much more continuous than that. So we have to understand what these results are telling us. Ultimately, we're getting artifacts of where we have low yield data points through here. And when we smooth this off, we can step back and say, we're making a pretty good decision. Okay? Now, this is also a field, this is in east central Iowa, and this one over here is also. It's sort of moderate in its soil characteristics. The interesting thing about variability, the interesting thing about this field is that we have incredibly high yields, north of 240 bushel, for large chunks of this field. We also see very large portions where we're below 75 bushel. This is sort of odd. This is an interesting characteristic. This field is managed under conventional tillage. We're in east central Iowa, and this guy's running a moldboard plow through. This is not common. All right? But the reason is because he's got such an incredible residue management problem. When you have that high of yields through that large of areas, this is a rule of thumb when we think about residue management. The tillage decision is going to be based on the worst residue management part of the field, always. That's just the way that it's done. And so this is, it puts residue removal puts an interesting tool in our toolbox on that front. So when we come in here and we look at the sustainability of the conventional removal practices, we see we can actually, even under conventional tillage, get residue off of the high-yielding parts of this field. But if we use a uniform removal practice across the whole field, we're just going to be devastating other parts. So this becomes pretty informative. What happened when we started to get through this is we had this sort of conflict that was out there. We had farmers saying, guys, I got a residue management problem. If you can go take some and you can give me a little bit of money for it, that's great. Okay? And then you had soil scientists saying, hey, you can only maybe have cobs, maybe some husks or leaves, or maybe none at all, and I got field trial data to prove it. The reality is they're both right. Okay? It's the subfield variability characteristics that define the problem. So where does that leave us? Right now, what you can do is lower your removal rates via your equipment choice, sort of the Poet model up there. Or you can go to interval removal schemas. That's the DuPont Pioneer model. And they're all going to be on hand-selected fields. So if this would grow, if this industry would grow and we have to start to access more and more, this becomes problematic for us. What we're really interested in, though, is the agronomic strategies. How can we actually start to influence what we can do with this? How can we agronomically support residue removal in a way that helps our entire system? And we've got some advanced equipment development ideas that can come in here also. So really quickly looking at the variable rate concepts. So these machines aren't commercially available, but we've seen elements of these variable rate concepts coming through lots of different equipment. So we kind of mashed them together for this assessment. And essentially what this machine could do is take 25% to 80% at 5% increments, or shut off and take 0. So when we look at this field again, here's our percentage removal, and I don't think you guys are going to be able to see that, but what we find is that most of this field we can get about 40% off of. That conventional practice that showed a carbon problem through that field was taking about 50. So it's interesting. You're right on that cusp on your mass balance there. For this field, we're going to take more throughout the whole field because we have a lot. Okay? And then this field's the interesting one for us again. What we've got here is obviously we've got to leave everything on these lower yielding parts, but we can take quite a bit on these higher yielding parts. I haven't talked to this grower, but I would venture to guess that if we could remove residue like this, we could get him out of conventional tillage. And if you wanted to do one thing for the long-term productivity of that farm, it would be get him out of conventional tillage. So when we look at what happens with these fields, now we can kind of start to assess what does an operation what does a piece of equipment have to do? All right. So this is the removal rate, and this is how much of the area of the field in that color, or how much of the mass of the residue is taken off at each of these buckets. You can see with this field it's bouncing around quite a bit. We've got a lot at 0. We've got a lot in this 40 to 45 range, in some places down here a little further. This second field, it's pretty much all coming off up here, like we saw with the uniform high yields. This one, we've got a large area here, and then it builds up to these high rates where we had those incredibly high yields. Okay? It's a small subset, it's a small sample size, but when we look at these three fields, if you can come in and build a machine that can adjust from 40% to 60%, along with shutting off, you can actually get about 90% of the residue that's sustainably available. That's a reasonable engineering problem. So we're seeing some progress with folks trying to put these kinds of, build this kind of equipment. The value proposition and the market size is still a little small. So they've got ideas, and the OEMs have different ideas and different things in their pipelines, but they need to see the market move for them just a little bit more. So let's look at agronomic strategies. We'll go back to this first field. So if we just took the conventional sort of rake and bale removal, used our conventional practices, what happened is we would get about 39 tons sustainably off of that 140-acre field, and we'd be causing a soil loss of about 336 tons a year. If we did one thing, put a rye cover crop in, everything else consistent, we move up to about 300 tons available, and we cut our soil loss not quite by half. So this is sort of a beautiful agronomic strategy that starts to get us into the decision game around this. If we come back and we say, let's put it all together for this field. Let's have variable rate. Let's put a cover crop on. Let's move to, I say no tillage, but let's say minimum tillage. We're not going to give up our big tractors and our tillage equipment entirely. But minimum tillage. We can take this all the way from that 39 tons to 418 tons a year off of this field, and now we're at a third of the soil loss. So this dynamic right here is how we drive that national number back up to that 450 million tons available. And these are things that we can start to work on now. Okay, so this is one of the first products we're releasing, and I'll just quickly cover this. This is sort of where we ended with our DOE work as we rolled this into the company and started the private effort. We're looking at about 1 million acres of corn stover harvested. We're not talking about the old style feedlot bedding kinds of use cases. We're talking about energy and animal feed use cases in this scenario. about 1 million acres will be harvested in 2014. There isn't any decision tools out there right now to support people. So we're trying to we've built this tool. It'll be released a little bit later this spring that's available to do that. We've got some ability to move from the field scale all the way down to a 30-foot grid in how we deploy this and how we look at it. It's compliant with NRCS conservation management planning. It's flexible in the data, so there's a lot of publicly available data that we can use. And then we've got some feedstock quality tools that help with the supply chain. The thing I'll point to down here, this is the supply chain management tool that DuPont uses for the cellulosic ethanol plant over in Nevada. And we've deployed this within their system, and they use this for helping support decisions this fall and going forward within their fields. So this is kind of how this thing is commercialized. The other interesting product that we've rolled out, or will be rolled out actually next week, how many people in here know about Iowa manure management planning? It's challenging, right? So we're requiring folks to run multiple software packages that take a lot of training. And I actually had a gentleman tell me that he's a CCA now. He used to do this. He'd do several hundred a year. He said that he knows one guy in the state that still does his manure management plans on his own. Which is interesting. We've got 7,671 feeding operations in Iowa that require a plan. So we've got all these models that have to be run in order to be compliant. So it takes a lot of training, it takes multiple packages, and it takes about 8 hours to do a standard animal feeding site. With the tools that we've built, this integrated modeling and data management framework, we can actually do this in about 30 minutes for a site now. So this is a product that'll be rolled out shortly, and it gets really interesting when we start talking about applying manure at rates relative to the local soil conditions. When we look at the grid samples, and we can start to use our manure much more effectively. This is an interesting problem we've got right now. We've got a lot of value in the nutrients in manure, but the compliance criteria don't let us apply it in a way that it actually is responsive to the information we know about local soil fertility. And we think we're going to be able to overcome that problem, and we're working with DNR to do that. So now I'll sort of move towards our precision ag suite, getting into the bigger data and the bigger simulation elements. As we start to think about the way we use these environmental process models and what's a little bit different, I'll take you back to when we were working in that DOE Regional Feedstock Partnership Program. We started working with some folks that have a biogeochemistry model. So they were bringing a component to us on carbon and nitrogen cycles, okay? And we would always have these conversations about they needed to take 6 or 8 months to calibrate their model to get the yields that we were seeing in the various case studies that we would work on. That always bugged me because I didn't need them to predict yield. We know yield. That's the piece of data that we have above all other data. We know yield. And so we would talk about this. How do we start to use the data that we have and then apply these modeling frameworks to extend our knowledge, all right? And so what you see here is sort of a stacked big data and simulation element. We've got really good DEM, digital elevation model data. This is LIDAR in Iowa, 3-meter kind of data. It's excellent. We've got reasonable soils data, and if we have grid samples, we have even better than Surgo. We have really good yield data. We can come around and we can start to calculate what's the soil movement going to be at the subfield scale. What's the 10-year soil organic matter change going to be given our practices? We can even start to project what's your nitrogen gas flux going to be. Feel free to challenge the quality of that data set. We know that's incredibly hard to model, but it's really useful information. And it's putting these things together in this way, we can start to answer some interesting questions. So let's look at a nitrogen example. There's a lot of work probably going on with folks in here even, trying to capture in a decision tool way what happens, all of these really complex problems in the nitrogen cycle. Great work, really important work. When we step back and we look at deploying decision tools at a production scale, we can simplify that problem. We got good nitrogen, we got bad nitrogen. Good nitrogen becomes a commodity that I can sell, or it's still available in the soil. Bad nitrogen is anything else. Okay? And when we do that, we're creating a valuable approach to using this information that doesn't necessarily have to understand those processes in the same level of detail. When we do this, now I can take 3 years of yield maps. I can stack these things together, and I can actually look and calculate what the nitrogen use efficiency is at a subfield scale for this field. What we see with this is we're really bad in some places. We're pretty good in other places. Overall, we're in that 30-35%, about what we see in our corn production systems. This still isn't a decision, though. But with this kind of information, now we can come back and we can extend it one step further to start looking at those precision ag decisions that we want to chase. Here's the important point about this. This was done with publicly available data in a yield map. We're able to extend the value of one chunk of big data using these simulation methods to start to understand this problem with the models characterized and applied appropriately. So how does that work forward a little bit more? Here's another one that we've recently come across that's sort of interesting. This is down in Adair County. It's hillier soil, right? It's not quite that prime land we see on the lobe or the Iowan surface. And this gentleman actually gets 2-acre grid sampling every 3 years, which is really, really nice data. When I see this, I actually sit back and I look at the nutrient reduction strategy plans, and honestly, I found myself wondering if we subsidized getting better information like this, would we actually be able to use the information to make better decisions such that they could make more money versus actually paying for the cover crop going in? That's an aside, but I think that there's actually a story there. When we look, this is right now the extent of precision ag as it's applied to this field. We get this grid sampling, and what you can see is the areas of higher and lower P content in the field. And then when we step that forward to the P application rate, you see these maps are directly inversed. Okay, so what we did is we came in and we said, what's the target yield? And then we applied according to the removal based on that target yield in the grain commodity directly from here. Well, when we get in here and we start to look at this, we say, wow, we must be getting really high yields in this area where we have to apply the P so heavily, right? Wrong. We have yield maps, we can see that, but we don't even look at them in this question now. When we get in here, and we see that we actually have incredibly low yields in these areas where we're applying all that P. This is a pretty simple big data exercise, a data overlay exercise. It's pretty informative, but why is the next question. Well, we can come in and we can start to evaluate how soil's moving in this field when we add the simulation components onto this. What we see, we're looking at this chunk of the field down here. Those same areas, we've got really high soil loss. Okay? This starts to answer that mass balance question. And in Iowa, we've got a tool called the phosphorus index, which is another critical part of the manure management planning process. But it essentially evaluates the risk of P loss based on the management criteria and the local conditions. Anything above 2 for a manure management plan is deemed not compliant by DNR. And you can see we've got a lot above 2 in this field, particularly in these areas. So what happens if we start to evaluate? We move it to the next level with the simulations, okay? We come back, let's grab a cover crop again. We just put it on select acres. We don't even have to put our cover crop across the whole field in this case. But you can see we can dramatically reduce that P index. And when we start to calculate what that does, about $30 an acre for that cover crop over the acres we applied it, we're looking at a savings of over $50 an acre with our NPK losses through there. These are ways that we start to get motivation to do these things driven by economics. So we're deploying all of this within what we're calling our high-resolution biogeochemistry framework. Now, there's a lot of complexities and moving parts into what we're doing here and how we're building this. What I'll say that we're really trying to do is we're trying to build a tool where we can take any form of data that might be available. We're going to maximize the big data that can flow in. We continue to see better and better information coming across the fields. And then we want to use every ounce of it that we possibly can to parameterize how we use the simulation components to move us towards the decisions. That's what we're really trying to do here. So with that, we need to change the way that we manage data. And so we've got a data structure we call our field state data structure, which again, rather than getting into a lot of the technical details, this essentially flattens the way we manage data so that we can be fast enough in how we bring it in and stream it and running it through our tools and subsequently getting those decisions out. And I'd be happy to go into more details about what these mean, but these are sort of core technologies that we've got underway right now that we think are going to be really important for delivering these things as we go forward. The next thing that I want to sort of get through, it's really interesting here. If we look at the way precision ag's moving right now, we're starting to make decisions at a smaller scale, but we're not seeing our financial products adjust to that scale. This is important. This is a big problem potentially as we start to move through, particularly where our systems are going to be stressed to make money in the near term as our commodity adjustments and land price input adjustments are out of whack a little bit. So one of the things we're working on, in order to actually evaluate what a precision planning decision does for you economically, we're bringing the economics down to the scale that we might want to make decisions at. So in this case, we'll take this field again, and we'll take our 3 years of yield map data, and we'll calibrate a crop growth model to it at a 10-meter grid. So essentially what we want to do is we want to say, we've got a crop growth model that we've got calibrated to our current hybrids, our current management practices, our current inputs, all of those components. And then we'll run it against 50 years of actual climate data. Okay? That gives us a data bank of performance that uses the big data that's available and tries to extend it to rebuild the actuarial tables that we'd want to build financial products off of. When we do that, now we can actually come in and we can start thinking about what happens with our crop budgets when we look at these productivity levels by grid cell, by year. And we have the kind of information where that can actually be meaningful now. Here's what's scary. So we're calibrated to the proven yield of 170 bushel in this field, 38 bushel per acre standard deviation, pretty high, right? It's a little ugly. We kind of believe it lately. But we're only making $47 an acre as an average by grid cell by year on $1,000 per acre inputs. Okay, this is challenging. Even worse than that, $235 per acre standard deviation. That reflects itself when you start to look at this profitability map through this field. Now, you say, how does it even work? Well, the reality right now is we buffer this system with financial products. Okay, so what we do is we go out and we buy the various insurance products, we subsidize it from the federal government, and we're essentially giving ourselves a clean slate where we can continue to make decisions that might not be right, but we're on average going to have ourselves buffered so we don't at least lose too much money. Okay, this is an interesting one when we start to dive into it. Years profitable. What we've got is 13% of this field. We don't stand a chance to make money ever. It's just that simple. But we don't change the management practices. All right, so let's start to play some games with this. Let's start to exercise some decisions. We'll take grid cells where we're going to lose $250 an acre or more, and we'll slide them out of production. Okay? We have to redistribute costs. We're still going to be paying $475 an acre rent for this field. We're still going to have the same fixed costs that have to be redistributed to the acres that we are farming. Some basic economic redistribution on here. What that does is it creates a break point for every field in operation. All right, of where is that loss level that you start to become more profitable. In this field, it's about $38 an acre loss, because when we cut off at $250, you can see we're starting to improve profitability here. And we cut our standard deviation in half. This gets interesting. It's just very simple. Throw some acres out, and I make more money. And I need to spend less money to buffer the same system. Now let's start to think about the financial products just a little bit more. If I've got 13% of that field that never stands a chance to make any money, and I'm a lender putting $1,000 an acre into it to farm it, the interest on that $1,000 going onto one of those acres has to be higher than the interest on an acre that's going to make money 45, 48 out of 50 years. It just has to. We don't do that right now. The other piece is our insurance premiums. We went ahead and modeled a 75% of proven yield multi-peril insurance product against this data bank of productivity that we created. What you can do with that is you can start to look at what the payouts would actually be across the various parts of the field. The moral of the story is, other than catastrophic, you know, some of the hail, those kinds of things, we don't really even need insurance on a lot of this field. And we're paying huge premiums based on low productivity for parts of the field too. This becomes pretty informative. All right, so let's continue this game. Let's adjust our insurance premiums like we just saw. Let's adjust our interest rates based on real actuarial risk that we've created. And now let's start to cut off at $250 an acre loss. Now we're starting to see some serious profit gains. Okay? This is compelling when you're looking at an operation like this. The next thing we want to do is we want to think about other choices. So let's generically throw ourselves a USDA program or a bioenergy crop, some scenario of productivity where we can take any cell losing $200 an acre or more and we replace it. Okay? It doesn't have to make any money. It just has to function at that $200 per acre loss level. Right? This is important if you're in the bioenergy sector because you're saying, I don't really have to compete with corn. I just have to compete with the corn that's losing a whole bunch of money in a lot of these fields. When we do that, now we've got our profit level all the way up to $105 an acre. We still have a standard deviation problem, but we've got a map that's starting to look much more operationally tenable when we step through it. So what if we go one more step and we start thinking about the land tenure issues that are on all of our minds here? In this case, we're just going to take cash rent, and we're going to redistribute the cash rent based on profit potential. You might ask, why would a landholder do that? You know, you still have to give them the same amount of money, so it feels like a shell game. But it's not a shell game when you're readjusting the financial products that buffer it. All right, so if you're putting in less money on less profit potential acres, that's going to change your requirement of your financial product from a risk profile standpoint when you start to move through. So when we do that, we see these adjust in a pretty significant way. What's the net impact of that? We put it all together. We take a profit map that looks like this. It's hard. That's tough. And we can actually get it just with these adjustments, agronomic management, financial product management. We can get a map that now you can start to look at and say, I can build an operation around that. Okay, this becomes pretty interesting. There is a lot of dominoes that have to fall in that whole scenario that we just laid out, and there's plenty of challenges in making a lot of those dominoes fall. But the interesting moral is that there's a lot of places where we can actually make progress without having to have onerous policy initiatives and other things like that come into it, where the economics guide us. So that wasn't necessarily operationally tenable, just taking 10-meter grid cells out of one crop and put it in another. So we might start to get interested in what does look like something we could do. And in this case, we take this area of the field and this area of the field and we put it into switchgrass. A lot of the same assumptions. And what happens here is we get quite a bit of biomass that we can sell. Almost the entire field's managed sustainably, pulling the switchgrass and our residue off as we'd want to do, and our soil loss is quite low. Okay? What happens to the long-term productivity? This gets into another product concept that we're working on. I'll point to these maps up here really quick. This is the status quo 10-year soil carbon change in tons per acre. Precision ag, as we're managing it right now, is going to increase diversity of the soil characteristics in our fields. The reason is because we're punting on some acres. Things that aren't productive now, we're going to give them less nitrogen, we're going to give them less seed, we're going to produce less above and below ground biomass. We're going to increase variability. That's not desirable. If we go into a management like we saw in that last slide, we can get a much more uniform soil carbon map through that field. This is what we're targeting. We're trying to pull these things together. Now, this is an interesting idea. when we look at that, the economics front to back, we can start to evaluate some interesting opportunities. Let's look at absentee landholders getting into this land tenure issue. A cover crop costs about $300 to $400 over 10 years. Over that 10 years, we believe, based on some initial tests with this field, we can impact soil properties enough that we can actually move across the CSR scale, which I know we've got some real fans of CSR as a basis for how we trade land. Right now, it is what we do in Iowa. You start at a certain dollar per CSR point, and that's just the starting place at the auction. And we believe we can start to see things where $300 to $400 investment could give you a CSR gain of $500 to $800 to maybe even $1,000 over a 10-year span. This is appealing. This is an interesting place where we can bring investment from the absentee landowner, which they're perfectly willing to invest in tile because it's a clear value proposition, right? If we can give them some other ones, that becomes pretty powerful. But then how do we also get them engaged in annual revenue in their lease contracts, adapting these things so it's more of a partnership? Here we took this standard scenario we've looked at of the $475 cash rent, and we know the profitability. We redesigned the lease product a little bit. The first thing you're going to do, if you're going to complicate the lease product, you've got to give the landholder a little bit more profit. They're not going to do it otherwise, okay? So what we did here is we said, let's come in. This lease product is a baseline $200 per acre. That's where you're going to start with. And then every grid cell in here that makes more than $200, the landholder gets 80% of the profit. All right? Any grid cell that doesn't, the landholder, you're done. That's the payment. Okay? So what we do here is we take about $6 an acre profit and move it back to the landowner. But in that process, we cut the standard deviation in half. So what we did here is we actually reduced the risk burden that the operator has to take on, and I would contend we'd easily make that $6 back with lower insurance products on that field. And again, this is a map that looks a lot better for us in terms of building an operation around. This is pretty exciting in terms of finding ways that we can pull these things together and drive better decisions with the economics of the system and the realities of the system we have right now. One of the other things we're pretty excited about, or think there might be quite a bit of potential around, is consumer-driven certification. Okay? We're seeing this. I actually recently just learned about the extent that this happens in the forestry industry. There's hundreds of millions of forest acres that are certified by a couple of entities, and folks like Home Depot and Lowe's and different organizations like that require certification in order of the acres that their products are sourced from. We're seeing some things like this start to emerge within this bioenergy and bioproduct realm, and it'd be interesting to see how that works within the commodities realm. I know the commodities groups won't like this. Right, they look at it as a burden. The interesting thing that could potentially happen, though, is can these kinds of certifications bring more consumer dollars into our ag systems to help support some of these decisions? That's an interesting perspective that we're sort of working on also. And I think that the framework that we've got in place and the way we do these kinds of analytics and simulation can help make this easier for growers as we go forward. So that was the technical information we wanted to pass along. Any questions?
Thank you. So, does anyone have any questions? I've got a question. I know we talked about this a little bit today over lunch. As a plant breeder, I look at it, and if we're talking about changing management on a subfield scale, I look at it as going, can we change the hybrid that we use in that subfield scale? And from the standpoint of, while we're all trying to improve cultivars for improved drought tolerance or improved abiotic stress tolerance, there's always a trade-off. So the possibility of being able to use these drought-tolerant cultivars that have a yield trade-off in that area while still using a well-adapted cultivar that doesn't have a yield trade-off because you're planting it in the best part of your field, I just see how that could easily maximize yield from that standpoint. So I think we talked about that. Is there other comments, do you think, for plant breeders to take away from this?
Sure. So summarizing the question, if we're going to start downscaling our decisions, how does customization of hybrids relative to highly local planting decisions and environmental conditions, et cetera, how does the plant breeder respond to that and take advantage of that idea? So what we see right now is the two big groups out there, Monsanto and their IFS program and Pioneer and their Field 360 program, are working on plant population, and they are moving towards variety selection at the subfield scale. The reality is if you can manage the information to make a decision and support the production of varieties and hybrids that can adapt to those conditions at a highly local scale, the profitability impact is potentially massive. I mean, we even look at really dry years like we had. There's still parts of fields that continue to be too wet in those scenarios, and vice versa. And so I think that the capacity to actually create the adapted hybrids, I don't have a great sense of that, but to the extent that they can be created, they can certainly be used, and we're seeing the kinds of data management and the kinds of simulation to guide those decisions emerge.
I have two questions. Firstly is a little bit technical. So how big is the target environment you are looking at to make decisions? You said a very local environment. So how big is this environment? 1 mile by 1 mile?
So the question is, what is the scale we're looking at making decisions at? I think the shortest answer is whatever is the most profitable. And what we really see in terms of the fields we work with, in terms of the systems we're working with, it's sub-acre. It's sub-acre that we're talking about trying to make a lot of these decisions at in order to really get to the highest level of productivity and efficiency. We do a lot of the analyses in that all the way from, say, 3 meter to 9 meter and 10 meter kinds of scale right now in order to make sure that we're capturing the effects that we want to capture, but it's almost certainly going to be sub-acre when it fully materializes.
Another question is today in this changing environment, so how do you do the precision agriculture, because weather condition, the climate condition is changing from year to year, so how do you deal with this challenge?
Yeah, so the question is with climate and economics, markets, all of those things changing so dynamically, how do you implement precision ag? So everything that we've done points to needing at least $100 per acre value proposition in order to get so deep into this that you have the ability to collect, manage, use the big data, and have the equipment that can subsequently implement the decisions. So economically, when you look at it, I think that it's not so complicated to define. I think about $100 per acre value proposition is what has to be there for large-scale implementation of these things. And I've heard similar numbers in terms of Monsanto's IFS goals also. When you get into the climate kinds of pieces, that's an interesting question because there's a lot of looking at in-season management practices. I struggle with that with our systems locally because we don't do that much in season. We have the ability to make some in-season adjustments, but the reality of adapting once you get past a certain growth stage becomes pretty challenging in our current systems. If we want to go put pivots out, certainly across all our fields, certainly we have a lot more options there. When you start thinking about these kinds of methods, you heard me talk about live streaming data, right? And you saw the notion of cheap, scalable compute. What those tie to is the idea that as long as there's still decisions to be made, we can stream the best information that we have, whether that be the last 2 weeks' weather coupled with the next week's forecast, as you're going in, those sorts of things, and then the ability to manage lots and lots of calculations affordably to run the scenarios around that need to be run.
So I have a question. The farmer that does the 2-acre soil samples, he hired you to do this for him, this analysis of his field, and then he gives you the soil samples, and then how long do you stay with him in the long run? Is it every year he asks you back, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the question is the case where we had the 2-acre grid samples, what does the relationship look like going forward? So this is actually, this is not a commercial product that we have rolled out. So we're working with him as a case study within another effort where we're building some things out. The way that we'll deploy these products, that particular product, what you saw there, will actually be through a value-added reseller. Specifically, this guy, the farmer, had to go wrangle and pry that information away from his co-op that did the soil sampling and the fertilizer application, and they didn't want to give it up, right? And that's a non-standard business model for them. They don't know what to do with that information in terms of value add, but they know it's got to be valuable and they don't want to give it up. Interesting aside, you sent me off on a loop here. So have you guys heard of My John Deere? It's this interest. So John Deere in 2011 put modems on all their machines. So every piece of data, telemetry, application data, all sorts of things from all these machines just stream. They just move through cyberspace into the John Deere system. And there's a lot of really wonderful things about this. We're working with them to actually build some products that can be value adds around this My John Deere API, automated programming interface is what they call it. This co-op that used this, they hate it. They hate it so much that they trick their monitors and shut the modem off so that John Deere doesn't get that information from their piece of equipment that's out there. So the data challenges, you sort of hit on one that's really major in the system, and it's one of the things that we continue to watch and we continue to try and figure out is where's the right access point where you can find the value proposition where the right person has the right information. And that's not insignificant. That's a serious challenge in rolling these things out.
So at what point will the financial institution be those who lend the money? At what point are they going to interject themselves into this?
Yeah, so the question is, at what point are the financial institutions going to interject themselves into this? They're interjecting themselves right now with due diligence, right? So they're seeing these market shifts, and what we're seeing is we've got auditors out on farms all over the place looking at the asset bases and reappraising everything, right? So they're very anxious right now, and we're actually trying to work with them around how can some of the things that we're doing here using some of this data help them actuarially price their products. And so I suspect that we're actually going to probably make some traction fairly quickly on the lender front. And while that seems like it might be a bad thing for a farmer, I contend that it's really not, okay? Because they're going to make it expensive to make bad choices.
Well, I guess the other question is, can you let the financial institutions wrestle that money out of the co-ops, wrestle that information out of the co-ops?
So the question comment was, can we let the financial institutions wrestle that information out of the co-ops? That's a good question. So where we see that push point happen is with landowners, particularly institutional landowners, not so much the standard inherited mom and pop landholder, but the more institutional ones require certain amounts of reporting from farmers now, and they have all the power. Because you want to lease the ground, you're going to have to give us this palette of information. And so I would imagine that if the value proposition flows through, the lenders would have the same authority because the cash is king.
That's all more questions in the back, and I have time for one more. So do you want?
Yeah. Who's the target market for the MNP 360?
So the question is, who's the target market for the MMP 360? That's the one of our products that has a tendency to cut across, all the way from your Iowa Selects, the big hog outfits, the big feedlot outfits, all the way to individual growers. Where we're focusing business development is again sort of in that value-added reseller, where we would prefer to have less customer interactions, right? It's easier for us to support, make people that are doing them now more efficient at doing them, and have them handle the individual customer interactions. But I suspect that we're going to see a mixed bag all the way down to the grower level, because even the folks because we're underselling the current market significantly, and so they're going to see that, and they're going to try and take it on themselves, and they may want to chase that route. The other interesting thing that's happening is we're actually seeing soil sampling labs and co-ops that have worked on the fringes of this MMP process before. There's a mandatory soil sampling at a minimum 10-acre grid. They prefer 5. They'd really like 2, but it's got to be at least 10-acre grid. So there's a lot of folks that have businesses that work on the fringes right now. They've looked at trying to do the whole MMP service as an extension to their core business, but it's been too complicated. I got to train a bunch of people. I got to employ people. I got to pay for software packages. I got to manage updates all the time. So we have several co-ops and one soil sampling lab we're talking to where they may actually build an MMP service. And they're not necessarily looking to make a bunch of money on that part. They would sort of pay the fees that we would require to get it done, and it would be used to grow their core business in the soil sampling arena or other service arena.
If you have more questions, please come up front and ask David, and I know he has some cards if you'd like some information from him. But thank you again for
Thanks.
A full list of agronomist podcasts are available at the Department of Agronomy website, www.agron.iastate.edu.